You're mute.
Yeah, I know. Now you'd think after years of this, we'd never need to be reminded.
Nah.
Um, I think this will be a smaller group, so that's great. We can have more conversation. Um, I'll put forward a couple of slides and then I'll step back and we can just sort of talk, especially because we're just a couple of us. You've probably been exposed to a little bit about what network science is in the last presentation that you went to. Typically, we look at stuff like this, network scientists, and we try to say, okay, here's where you can do more knowledge transfer. Here's where communication is breaking down. Here's where it's working really well. Here's some people on the edges that we're worried might be at risk for flight. There's lots of decades and decades of research that support concerns and challenges just by looking at something like this. Underlying this, of course, is some matrix algebra, which is how we can draw our statistics and actually say something with hard empirical evidence rather than sort of it doesn't feel good or it looks like people aren't happy or something like that. We can use network science. Let me see if I can use. All right, wait a second. Sorry. I don't know why it would work. There we go. What network science can tell us about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we can ask some of slightly different questions. Are members of groups reaching out similarly, whether they're from a historically underrepresented group or an overrepresented group? Are they equally connected to senior leaders? Who are they turning to for career advice? That has a lot of implications. For instance, if people of color are primarily turning to people of color for career advice, there's two possible things that might happen. One, because they're already historically underrepresented, they might not be getting the most senior, most sort of in the inner circle kind of advice as other people might be getting. And two, for those few people of, for instance, of color who've gotten into the senior leadership, they're going to be overwhelmed with demands for their time. And many of you who work in this space know that that's a really common thing, that all this other sort of work goes on in addition to your sort of normal job when you're a person from a historically underrepresented group who gets to be quite senior. So we can take a look, we can ask all those questions, and in asking those questions, we can bring precision to our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. We can see where things are working, where there are still challenges. And we can also take a look at how can we create some accountability metrics? Are people actually developing diverse talent? They say they are, but are they? Who is a high leverage person in different areas, different functions, different demographic groups? Let's leverage those people to make sure that they're included in conversations that matter to those groups, that matter to the organization. Can we see who's doing well and maybe codify some of that? Can we recognize people who might be at risk? Can we assess the effectiveness of our diversity investments? If you're like me, you've gone through unconscious bias training. I actually do unconscious bias training. Seems like half the world has gone through that at this point. Well, we can test, are the people who underwent that having more diverse relationships than the people who didn't? Any kind of diversity investment that you make, you can actually test. Are people integrating better? Are departments, are units integrating better as a function of the fact that they receive some training? Are we getting some ROI? So these are things when you take that sort of overhead view that you can guess. I'm going to go into a few things that we know are challenging for people who come from underrepresented groups. I'm going to talk specifically about women because that's where my research lies, but a lot of this applies to people of color, people who come from less affluent backgrounds, LGBTQ+, other communities that are not overrepresented at senior levels. And they tend to have three concerns, all of which you can test by looking at the network. So one is who's in their network. And so one's who's in their network and who's not. The other one is where are they in the network? And the third one is how is their network structured? So I'll just go through those and then I'll take a pause so we can discuss this and other ideas that might interest you. So if you are a person from an underrepresented group, historically underrepresented group, and you go and you form working relationships, sometimes friendships or connections with other people, colleagues, you will drift because it's a comfort. We're hardwired. We just do it. You will drift into relationships with people who are like you. And if you're already from an underrepresented group, you're going to be drifting into relationships with people who tend to be underrepresented and therefore have less status and fewer resources than other people. So I know I've experienced this where I suddenly find myself at important meetings talking to the spouses of senior leaders rather than talking to the senior leaders themselves. It has happened to me more times than I'd like to admit at faculty get-togethers where I'm suddenly talking to all the spouses from my male faculty rather than conversing with our dean and talking with other people. So we did some work on this. We took a look at the number of connections in one organization. Some of this is in my Sloan article. And we could see that at every level, junior, professional, senior, women had fewer connections to senior leadership than men had. And that even just got more dramatic at the professional and senior levels. And that's a big disadvantage. You don't learn about opportunities. You don't understand how the business works as well. And this was a company that was quite shocked because they had a formal sponsorship program in place that they thought was going very well. And so it's problematic. Where women are in the network is related to this idea that they might drift, and we all drift into relationships with people who are like us. And we took a look at where people were central in the networks, where they were really critical in the networks. And we found, holding administrative role constant, as we did through all our research, that women tend to be central when people are making decisions that aren't that important. They're turning to women, and women have a lot of say on those decisions. Where they have a lot less say is the important networks, the one about critical decision making, sources of new ideas, important information. So they're shaping the work less than the men are in their networks. They're influencing it less. And that can be a really hard thing to see as an individual. You may feel like you're super connected in your network, you've got great friends, you feel highly engaged, and be completely clueless that there's important decisions being made and you're not in the room. I'll just do this last point and then we can stop for a while. And that's this idea of how your network is structured. Decades of research have shown us that all things being equal, all your education and skills being equal, you will get benefits, or there are things that will happen to you depending on where you are in the network. So Bill here, who is reaching out, you can tell by the arrowheads, but no one's reaching into Bill. That expertise is going untapped. Nobody's understanding or not really connected to what's going on with Bill, not leveraging it. There on the right, Pam, the center of the network, a little cluster there. Great, really great access to new information, really can coordinate, implement among that group really well. You probably want to see your small teams looking like that. And then this guy, John. John is actually something we call a boundary spanner. And we know that people like John who connect different clusters make more money, get promoted faster, they're more likely to be identified as top talent, they're more likely to be identified in innovation. They're really important movers and shakers in networks. And what some of my research has shown is that men are far more likely to occupy that position with less backlash, that's a whole other thing, than are women. And that's holding constant for their role. So I just dumped a ton at you. I do have some ideas about what you can do, but I want to pause and take discussion points. And I see a hand pop up, so go ahead and talk.
Hi, it's Sarah. I was just wondering if through any of your research, we'd been able to identify kind of like experiences that I've had in work is that the senior men seem to help out the senior men in their networks, but any senior women, they don't help women for some reason. I've personally experienced that.
So there's a couple of things that might be happening. You're right. That is what we find in the research, that men are more likely to help men and women are less likely to help women. And there's a couple of things that might be going on. So one thing that might be going on at the senior level is that women already feel that they have less of a standing than men, even at their same position. So they're less willing to take risks in terms of putting women forth, because women are considered risky because they are not fitting what you're supposed to look like, which is male and white and, you know, from a certain background and things like that. So they may hesitate to take those risks and be less likely to take those risks because they are women in their positions. So they're actually, we find they're actually somewhat more likely to promote men than they are for women. That's less risky. And so that is one explanation. Another potential explanation we find is that many women, because we're so trained to focus on relationships our whole lives, that's such a part of our socialization, is that that's how you should define yourself in terms of relationships. You got to be good at relationships. You should always be prioritizing relationships. You should think about a relationship before you think about yourself. That's drilled into us in lots of different ways. Some women really struggle with seeking out help from the people in their networks. I've had so many women tell me they don't want to use the people in their networks. And men don't have as many cultural barriers about saying like, hey, you know what, I'm out looking for some work. Do you know about a position? Or, I can't find this one guy. Do you know him? Could you put in a good word for me? Women are a little more hesitant to do that. So that could be another factor in why so sort of mentees or the sponsorees are not asking and reaching for some of the specific help. The sponsorship programs that do the best do a lot of training around this. Not only training sponsors as to some of the implicit biases they have and how they can counteract them, but also training the people who are being sponsored how to ask and how to leverage that connection. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Is it Varsha?
Hello. I just want to bring something very different. Women's leadership. And I'll just put Jacinda Ardern, that we want to practice a different kind of leadership, a servant kind of leadership. And we bring qualities, but I think maybe the world is not ready. And I feel that the future is female, because I see people in the climate change agenda or whatever. They may not be at the top table, but they are movers and shakers. But it's a different kind of leadership. And the report that I would recommend people to read is from the Fabian Society around broken ladders. So I don't want to climb a broken ladder. I want to practice a different kind of leadership and do it my way. So, it's just something I think after a while trying to emulate, I cannot be a man, but I can practice what I do well and be recognized for it. Sorry.
No, I think that is so important. I think it's so important. And honestly, management in general has more. So we tend to have a relational kind of management style, probably because of all our socializing, whatever what we do. And you can see the field of management has shifted towards a more relational kind of approach. But I hear you, and I get so frustrated, especially I have lots of colleagues who do network stuff. And one of the things that they do, and I'll actually suggest it, but with a big caveat, is to say, let's look at who's successful and then teach everybody else to do that. And you got to say like, well, that's not necessarily the right approach. How about what have we created that makes it harder for other people to succeed? Maybe we have developed, maybe this model of success, highly competitive, whatever it is not the model that's really going to benefit our organization. And when people ask me what's the benefit of having women in more senior positions, aside from moral considerations, aside from just simple numbers and things like that, how does having women on senior leadership affect the work? Well, we find that women are, it's really funny word, they're less overconfident. So men tend to be overconfident in their view of the situation and the decisions that they make. And because women are less overconfident, they tend to produce higher quality decisions. They tend to think about them more and involve people in the decision making. We also know that women are, generally speaking, seem to have, when there's ethical murkiness, they're more likely to see a problem as unethical than to see it as ethical. And that works really well when you're doing some kind of, how are we reporting out to our shareholders? Well, we know that they have fewer questions about those kinds of things. And there's a bunch of other benefits, but I hear you. I agree. I think it's not a matter of how can we get, again, people who are underrepresented to fit into the mold of people who are overrepresented. How can we're not broken. How can we change the way we do work so that everybody is able to do the work the best that they can?
Can I just leave one? You talk about networks. So communication networks, logistics networks, we talk about load balancing. And I think time has come for the wider world to think, how do we balance the load of the change that we're experiencing? And that's where the women and part of what role they play would be part of a more sustainable load balanced world. I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Emily, you had a question or a thought?
Yeah, I did. And thank you. This has been really interesting so far. So my question is quite specific. So I work in an organisation with around 350 people, and there's been a huge push towards equality. So we're being sent on women in leadership courses, and out of that, we're developing a women's network. But that it's very much in its infancy. So I wanted to ask for advice from you or from other people on this call as to how it could be best to structure that network so it's not just a vacuum of women in amongst a community of men and women.
Yeah, and actually a similar question came up in the last breakout. I think there is a natural life cycle of, we call them employee resource groups, these networks in the US. In the very beginning, when people felt the need to form that kind of network, it can be a great home for people, a place that you can sort of relax, a place that you can share your personal experiences and understand if other people have had those personal experiences. Oh, I'm not the only one who wasn't able to get my computer for the first 3 weeks, all those kinds of things. And I think it's really important at that phase. But soon, of course, what you want to do is make yourself not needed, right? You don't want to have a women's network because you're so part of the organization that just seems silly, right? So what you need to do is to be able to make sure that your concerns are moved into the organization and that the organization does the work of being more inclusive. So a couple ways you can do that I've worked with other organizations that have done that. So one way is to have some kind of mandate or suggestion or performance evaluation where everybody has to join a network that they don't identify with. And your role in joining those networks is to learn how to be an ally, and you listen. That's what you do. You just listen and learn about other people's experiences. So that's sort of one strategy. Other strategies are, how do I connect to points of power? So maybe you take your senior leadership team and you want to say, all right, let's form some subgroups working on how we can better integrate women, or how we can move women through the talent cycle, or how we can help junior women so that they're better poised to become that emerging talent. And then you have small groups of women that are paired with senior leaders. So one of the benefits of that is the senior leaders see you working. So they start a relationship with you, understanding your capabilities. And you can work on the work that's important to you. You're forming the relationships. And then hopefully you're getting more in the consciousness of the leaders so that they are not only form the relationships with you, but starting to see, the challenges inherent in that you're facing. And then another strategy that a lot of these networks need to do is just bump up communication, celebrate successes. And I don't know what works best in your organization, if that's an ebook. What I find works best in organizations is you have some committed people at the senior leadership level who are telling stories, that it's happening every time they talk. They're talking about areas of success. They're talking about highlights. They're praising people. They're just continually showing that everybody in this organization is contributing, and I'm valuing all those contributions. So that kind of quickly is just a few ideas.
Thank you.
I didn't get a chance to talk about what you can do if you're from an underrepresented group. I just say, I think for maybe all of this is to first and foremost understand the importance of those social relationships and that you might not be a part of them. I think a lot of times people think I can get by on my technology and my career and my education, and that works for a while, but it's those social relationships that keep pulling you through an organization. And a lot of people are simply unaware of how important they are. And then if you are from a historically overrepresented group, there's a lot of strategies that you can trade for creating an organization that's more inclusive. One that I particularly like are these gig rotations, that if you're at a leadership level, you provide opportunities for people to work with each other. And that allows them to build relationships over the work and see each other's capabilities and abilities. And that helps people move through the organization rather than being, sort of ghettoized in, for instance, women in HR, or something like that, so that you're really sort of dispersed into some, particularly in production and some of the core functions in the organization from which the senior leaders come from. So I could clearly talk about this all day, but I think we are due back in the main group, and thanks very much. I hope you found some of it useful.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.